changes I'd make. Now I want to talk about one of the most complained about sections of the game. The last judge runback. This runback has a reputation already for being incredibly bad. And yeah, it's pretty bad. I think the only reason it's so bad though is because you can't just run past all of the enemies. Not easily anyway. Because of this, you can't develop or rely on muscle memory as much. And you have to spend some time to carefully maneuver around one enemy type in particular. This guy, the Driznit, and specifically the one right by the room entrance. This guy just kind of sucks in general. I think this whole last judge issue would be fixed if you could easily run past these guys, and I don't think this would be that hard to do either. If I were Team Cherry, I would have them take, say, half a second longer to aggro.
My love for Bloodborne is blind. I've come to accept that. If I were to argue whether or not that game is good, my arguments would quickly devolve into blind glazing and subjectivity. Silksong is the best single-player game I've played in a while, but I wouldn't call myself a glazer for it in the same way that I do for Bloodborne. I consider all my love for that game completely justified, and because of that I've avoided exposing myself to criticism for the game since I started playing it. I knew that any critic of this game would bring up good points that genuinely make me rethink the quality of this masterpiece, and simply I did not want this to happen. Then I actually watched a Silksong critique video.
Glavobolja od vina, a nigde aspirina. Sinoć bila sam sa tobom pijana, na podu posteljina, u sobi punoj dima, slika poznata, to je prevara.
Like, imagine the hubris of sitting an enemy in a runback, not even attempting to run past them, then say with your human mouth that this is an issue of the game itself and that the game should be patched to make up for your own laziness. This actually made me look at an earlier section of the video. This YouTuber is talking about how they want the game to respect your time. They say that it's too hard, and that the high halls and growl arenas should be shortened and simplified, while at the beginning of the video saying that they didn't use red tools very often. Like, shut the fuck up. Honestly, just shut the fuck up. Why on God's great sinful earth do you believe that this game is hard, no I didn't use the mechanic that makes the game easier, is a reasonable thing to say? What are we doing here? Come on. The most telling part of this video is the writer saying that losing resources for red tools forces you to either grind or go to a different area, which is probably what Team Cherry intended. But after this, I quickly fell deeper into the rabbit hole of complaints about Silksong, each one more misguided than the last. People not using the tools, often literal tools, that the game gives them, and then complaining that the game is too hard, or refusing the notion that the game's discomfort carries any artistic intention because they couldn't be bothered to look for it. I want to talk about them one by one just to be efficient, so in the beginning, let me introduce you to Haso. Haso here has beaten the Souls trilogy on level 1, and because of this he believes that any game that poses a challenge to him is being unfair. In this belief he doesn't notice the fact that there might be more than one type of difficulty, that a game might reward different skills, and that to beat Souls games you require endurance and patience, while Silksong rewards things like execution and spatial awareness. Next he discusses the fact that the game doesn't give you enough rewards for exploration and bosses. This, I would say, is fair to some extent. For example, the 12th Chorus, Growl, and quite a few other combat arenas is where I notice that the game often doesn't reward combat feats with much more than area unlocks. If you really do think that's a deal breaker, I do recommend you learn how to just skip them, but obviously I don't think that that removes the issue whatsoever. That being said, area unlocks are still an important part of the world, so it's not that horrible in my opinion. And plus, adding a reward at this point would screw up the player's progression absolutely. An example of how this would screw up the game's progression is actually an idea that Haso presents, giving the player rosaries every time a boss is defeated.
there is still a second, larger problem that is harder to fix. I should get currency for beating every single boss in Combat Room. It's like Game Design 101 to reward the player for every difficult challenge. I could formulate a logical argument as to why this change needs to occur, but do you really need me to explain why Souls games give you souls for beating bosses?
Now, to begin, let me explain something to you. Silksong is not a Souls game. It's not a multiplayer game or a gacha game, and the rosaries do not play the same role as currencies from those games. In other games, especially Souls games, the base currency is directly connected to the game's vertical progression. In Souls games, you use souls or echoes or runes to level up, granting you a flat and direct boost to damage, health, and other attributes. Leveling up these attributes in Silksong, meanwhile, requires finding specific items with specific upgrades. While rosaries can sometimes be used to buy mask shards, spool extensions, and crafting upgrades, their main use is horizontal progression, so benches, maps, and tools. Adding more rosaries to the economy would remove their sense of scarcity, which is one of the most important aspects of this game's difficulty. Doing so with mods, as Haso suggests doing, would screw up the game's progression irreversibly. Imagine, for example, if the last judge gave you like 600 rosaries and then you'd go through the underworks being able to buy every bench however many times you wished. You might enjoy it, but that would ruin the entire area. Not just that, a significant aspect of the Citadel's entire setting is the fact that right before you enter it, you see the corruption and exploitation keeping it afloat. And none of that would work nearly as well if you entered the underworks with overabundant rosaries. Another complaint with lackluster rewards comes from crests. Haso believes that crests are not an adequate reward for how hard they are to get, because if there's one you don't like, it won't affect your gameplay, effectively giving you nothing. However, again, this isn't a Souls game, not all rewards are going to help you with vertical progression. And also, I don't think that getting a crest I don't like has ever left me disappointed. In fact, the first time that I found a crest, I knew immediately I wouldn't use it on my first playthrough, but I was still happy, because the journey to that crest was so entertaining, and more importantly, it showed me that exploring the world can reward me with a game-changing reward, and although I didn't like that crest, I would eventually find one that I did. Also, crests are an awful example of pointless exploration. I'd actually excuse you for not knowing this, because the wording is a bit odd, but finding more crests, even if you don't use them, grants you the Vesti crest, a flat upgrade no matter what crest you're using. Now that I think about it, this and the Architect's Key function as ways to reward you vertically for progressing horizontally, something that Hollow Knight also did really well. Your criticism just made me appreciate the game more, honestly. Last thing about the crests, Haso found himself unwilling to use the Witch crest because of its unconventional bind. He then suggests that this is a bad thing and suggests that it be fixed by making binds separate unlocks to movesets. Firstly, this suggestion only sounds reasonable when in the context of the Witch bind, because that bind has little to do with the moveset while being a drastic change. However, looking at the other crests, some binds are objectively worse than others, but the Beast crest is fundamentally designed around its bind. The Shaman crest is allowed to be the highest damage crest in the game because it has the only bind with a penalty, that being forcing you to the ground. Reaper and Architect both have fairly slow movesets to make up for their superior binds. If you just remove the binds from the crests, then Hunter, Wanderer, and Shaman would instantly become the best crests in the game, while Beast, whose identity and strength both rely on its bind, would become obsolete and, more significantly, uninteresting. That would mean having to heavily rework the entire crest system, and I just think, why bother? A crest from Silksong is akin to a weapon in an RPG or a character in a fighting game, in that it isn't just defined by its strengths, but also by its weaknesses. I love the Witch crest in part because it's so risky. I like the additional challenge of finding the situations during which I can heal and nuke the opponent at the same time. There's also something really cool about Architect being the only crest in the game without a Silk skill, and something equally cool about Shaman not having red tools. It makes me feel like I'm fully embodying the role that the crest represents, and that would be completely lost if I could just put on any bind on any crest. Next comes Haso's criticism of the boss fights. He claims that every boss feels as though it has just slightly too much health. He then mentions he doesn't use red tools. Haso's criticism of red tools is that you run out before killing the boss fully, meaning that using them exclusively doesn't just give you an easy mode. There is no follow-up to that sentence. That is a criticism.
I don't really think tools do make the game much easier, and they certainly do not make the game easy, but every boss has so much health that you can spam all of your tools and you might still not kill them. And using tools costs you scrap, so you can only have a few tool-only attempts before you have to grind for another attempt.
I remember hearing that and just staring at the screen in disbelief. Does he know that he can use both the needle and the red tools at the same time? Genuinely, I don't think he knows this. Also, does he want an easy mode? Like, I thought that if you beat all Souls games on level 1 that you like hard games. Or, you know, does that only count for games that force the player to run a million attempts to memorize a moveset, but when a game suddenly encourages you to actually learn its mechanics and utilize them correctly, that now needs to be skipped? By the way, at some point he shows footage of Hollow Knight in which he uses Grimchild and Boulder Shell. And I was just thinking, if I posted this while saying that the late game combat of that game is just iframe slop, you would consider that rage bait. Towards the end of the video, Haso talks about the Lost Lace boss fight. This is the game's true final boss, and this whole section proved every suspicion I had up until that point. Haso is really bad at Silksong. I've only ever played 2 Souls games, but those are 2 of the best AAA games I've played in my entire life. However, I find that my enjoyment of them stems from completely different reasons to most people, because so many of them have genuinely convinced themselves that slamming your head against the wall is not only an acceptable way of playing a game, but the only correct way. They would probably get mad if you called their games roll slop while also being the sole reason they carry that title. At some point, Haso mentions disliking the iframe heavy combat of late Hollow Knight. However, this game proves that he is completely lost without iframes. You see, the reason why criticizing a game for its difficulty is pointless is because by doing so, you are admitting that you got your ass handed to you, that you didn't utilize the game's many mechanics to your advantage, and that you would then still claim that you understand how the game works.
The bosses are not just puzzles where you need to figure out their moveset, but endurance challenges. The game is more designed for you to learn the moveset of a boss with the needle, and then maybe use some tools on a good attempt towards the end.
Let me tell you something. I beat Growl in 3 attempts. I beat Highhole's Gauntlet in 2. I beat Beastfly on my first session so fast I forgot it existed. Haso here says that he fought Lost Lace for 4 hours after exploring every nook and cranny of the game. I beat her in an hour with 7 masks, 4 spool extensions, an incomplete needle, and an empty tool slot. That's because I don't dilly-dally with memorizing boss patterns or trying the same strategy over and over again until it works. If I wanted to do that, I would install Geometry Dash, not a Metroidvania. No, I spammed red tools and skills and I looked for every opportunity to hit the boss, I played aggressive, and I got rewarded for it. Muyo from the first video actually mentions not using red tools because they didn't want to become over-reliant on them. However, becoming over-reliant on something is not an issue if the fucker dies. You're structuring your playstyle around sustaining fighting the boss for a long time, but not actually around killing them, and then you wonder why it's taking you a long time. A hard game shouldn't be forcing you to repeatedly do the same thing over and over again until you do it right. At least, in my opinion, a Metroidvania shouldn't. The difficulty that Silksong chooses to have is one that forces you to use all its mechanics to their fullest potential, because if you don't, the game will be time-consuming, bland, and tedious. Bosses don't require endurance and patience. You can beat them on that, but they don't require it. They require critical thinking, situational awareness, and the willingness to take risks, none of which Haso here seems capable of. The thing is, there are several bosses for whom I did utilize that trial and error style of combat, mostly because I forgot about the tools, I don't remember why. And guess what? It was way more boring. Every boss I fought this way took me way too long to kill and I wasn't having nearly as much fun. And I think the boss that expresses this duality the best is actually Sister Splinter. When I fought her at first, I struggled a lot. If you don't know, she summons minions that can do a Beyblade attack, which makes them invincible and also deal double damage. But then I realized, wait a minute, they're only invincible to the needle. I have the Silk Spear, which one-shots them, and because Splinter is so easy to hit, and because I have the Reaper Crest, I always have the Silk to cast it. After I realized this, I beat her in a single attempt. If you listen close enough, Haso's video is actually full of frustration over how Silksong doesn't conform to the conventions of a genre to which it doesn't belong. When Haso talks about tool-only runs, he states that the game doesn't have build variety.
That unlike Souls games, build variety will not save you since tools are well balanced as explained earlier. I respect Team Cherry's decision to not make tools too strong, but then don't you need another way to adjust the difficulty, like perhaps an easy mode?
That's because one of the main differentiating factors of Souls builds is your main attack being either melee or ranged. But that's not how builds work in Silksong. In all builds, you have to use your melee attack to some extent, because this is the only way of building Silk, which you need to heal, and red tools will usually not kill a boss alone. Now, within this framework, build variety is actually very expressive. Reaper is the only crest with some sort of alternate Silk generation, making it good in less aggressive, more well-rounded builds. In much of the critics' footage, you'll see them using exclusively Needle for damage while using this crest, which has one of the worst DPSs in the game. In my first playthrough, I also used this crest almost exclusively, but I used it with red tools such as Tax, Spike Balls and Boomerang, and it worked wonders on everything. The Hunter crest, meanwhile, does more damage if you land multiple hits without taking damage, meaning you can use it to either plan your playstyle around not getting hit to keep the buff active all the time, or boost attack speed with Flea Brew to activate the buff as fast as possible. You can then stack Hunter's Needle damage and relatively fast attack speed with the percentage damage increase of Flint Steel and have a high damage Needle build. And you can do a similar thing with Wanderer. Meanwhile, the Witch Crest has the highest amount of blue tool slots, allowing for many versatile builds that other crests do not. Or, if you've got balls, you can slap on Quick Bind, Multi-Blind, Trobio's Mirror and either Protective Bell or Extra Bind, and suddenly one-shot almost every non-boss enemy in the game by simply healing. Also, red tool builds are absolutely possible. If Haso claims that they're not, that can only mean that he didn't find the Architect crest, which is strange because he did find the 12th Architect NPC, and the Architect crest is right next to her. An important part of these builds is that they do not end in the tool menu. You have to adapt your playstyle and game plan to make them work, and you can't just set them up and then autopilot to victory. That's, again, because the difficulty of Silksong is not the same kind of difficulty as in Souls games or as in Hollow Knight, and playing the game as if this isn't the case will make the game painfully difficult and unfun. You need to adapt to every enemy by adjusting your playstyle based on their height, movement, the arena, whether or not they fly, and what crest you have equipped, resulting in one of the most complex and fluid combat systems I've played in my entire life. And it all goes right over your head because you're just expecting to play another Dark Souls.
I can't see what's happening. In order to win, I have to be focused on Lace and the stage damage at the same time, but everything is black with slight tinges of grayish white. The worst offender of this lack of visual clarity is when the tentacles appear underneath the spinning saw attacks. Although you can see it if you are looking for it in the gameplay, these tentacles are very hard to see in the heat of the moment while you're also trying to focus on what Lace is doing.
Now, here's the thing about void tendrils. You don't have to pay attention to them all the time. The two very clear indicators for void tendrils appearing are Lost Lace screaming and disappearing beneath the floor. In both cases, you don't have to pay attention to her for a few seconds, allowing you to completely lock in on dodging the tendrils, and if she does reappear immediately, that means you know exactly where the tendrils will appear. This took me seeing the attack like thrice to learn. Haso fought her for 4 fucking hours and didn't realize this. Okay, so I didn't originally have this part in the script, but I also saw the videos by that Second Wind guy and I felt like I should include at least one channel that people might actually know. This video is getting pretty long already, so I'm gonna speed through this. Why does the game start off with a harder pogo? Because it fits Hornet better, because it's faster, making it more fun, because it carries momentum, signaling that this game isn't Hollow Knight and shouldn't be thought of as Hollow Knight. Yes, platforming is more of a challenge since you have to aim. However, Drift Cloak makes platforming much easier, and all areas that require Pogo before Drift Cloak are optional. Saying that harder Pogo discourages the player from using it in combat is not true. I'd say that it even encourages you to use it more frequently in combos with other moves, like Dash Attack or Clawline. Talking about Clawline, the reason that Clawline is overpowered is not because it lets you engage and disengage quickly. It's broken because it lets you get above your enemies, which is a very advantageous position to be in, and is one of the biggest reasons that Hornet is stronger than the Knight. Another reason that Hornet is stronger than the Knight is that she heals easier for the same resources, resulting in her technically having more health. This is then balanced by having many enemies deal double damage.
In Hollow Knight, some bosses did 2 damage too, but only late game ones, and they did so to show size, intensity of the attack, and scale the game based on player acquired health.
This is just not true. It's a lie. Even if you mention that double damage enemies in Hollow Knight aren't as frequent, again, Hornet technically has more health, and if enemies didn't deal double damage, the game would be easy as hell for anyone that actually bothered to learn it.
And there's not a lot of room for growth scaling wise either.
Silk has an attack that does triple damage.
Making bodily contact with bosses also does 2 damage, which goes further to discourage usage of the movement abilities that transport you towards the boss, which, let me check my notes, is most of them.
Dash attacks launch into the air without contact damage, Clawline gets you closer to an enemy without contact, Hunter Crest Pogo makes you invincible as long as the needle hits the enemy first. I don't even know what you're trying to say.
If you're hit mid-heal, you lose all of the resource you were attempting to use, which is fine when it's only 1/5 of the total, but in Silksong, you lose over half of your entire resource bar and have to build back up to it all over again.
Again, healing is way faster in Silksong and you can do it in the air, making it much less likely that you actually get hit. Okay, let's talk about the next major video. One of the only outright negative videos I saw was this one. It is simply so full of bullshit that it's hilarious.
Art style is still gorgeous, the OST is amazing, they address the lack of color from...
Like, what does that even mean? Are you implying that the game being mostly grey wasn't a creative choice and rather some sort of accident that had to be addressed? Then they mention how this game fails because it appeals too much to the Souls audience. This just shows that even if you don't like how FromSoft approaches difficulty, many people still treat this game as if it were a Souls game, and so everything I said earlier applies here too. Anyway, one of the first significant things brought up is the issue of maps. Muyo and Haso here, different Haso, don't worry about it, talk about how they wish you had a map for every area immediately and didn't have to pay for it. Also, the compass should always be active and not an equipable tool. Personally, I have these two things called memory and eyesight, so I never put on the compass and don't really get its hype. After all, this is a Metroidvania. A core aspect of the genre is finding things on your own by looking with your own 2 eyes. One of the best examples of these two always looking at the map is they say that after Chakra leaves an area that she's impossible to find. However, if you're actually looking at the screen anytime you re-enter Belhart, you'll notice little hoops in the corner. And if you go investigate them, oh look, who'd have guessed, she's at the hub area. A more extreme example of always looking at the map syndrome. Okay, I'm shortening the script a little bit. Basically, there are 2 paragraphs which essentially shorten to I saw this one guy on YouTube complaining that he never found a good item, all while never finding more than 1 pulp bud, which is very funny, I think. Anyway, back to Muyo and Haso. Next, they mention double damage, so let me expand on something I said earlier. Both the Knight and the Hornet heal for the same amount of investment, 7 to 9 hits per 3 masks. However, in boss fights and fight rooms, the Knight has to wait for breaks in combat or take a risk to heal a single mask of damage, while Hornet can heal 3 masks safely by just running to a corner and jumping. This means Hornet heals easier, technically making her have more health, which needs to be balanced out with double damage. Outside of fight rooms, the Knight heals easier because it can collect infinite soul with Dreamnail, which is why it makes sense for much of the environmental damage to be nerfed. In short, I would say that this system encourages aggressive play because hitting an enemy is directly connected to healing with little in between, which Muyo and Haso disagree with, but they also complain about dying the whole time, so the hell do they know.
Even worse is he can use the gas grenades and the tornado to put you in a frame trap.
That is not what a fucking My culture is not your costume. Also, in case you are still taking their opinions on damage seriously, they bring up that Lace 2 takes 160 needle hits to kill, which sounds like a lot until you realize that Muyo said that that's from an unupgraded needle. By the time the player gets to Lace 2, by the way, they will most likely have at least 2 nail upgrades, 3 if they did the Tastes of Pharloom quest, which even when accounting for the ridiculous damage calculations this game uses about halves that number, and then you have to bring up tool and skill damage and very quickly you realize just how misleading 160 is. Breakable walls are not hard to find if you aren't looking at the map all the goddamn time. The vast majority of breakable walls have clear indicators that they're breakable, that being either holes in the texture or clear environmental indicators. I mean, sure, you're bound to miss a couple items and NPCs, but to a point where it severely hinders your ability to play the game, I simply cannot believe that. There are no map indicators to know where she went. Again, if you just don't look at the map all the time, you will notice... I already wrote this part. They also talk about map vendor locations in the Citadel. They say that the maps now are hidden behind breakable walls. I should say that there are very few maps hidden this way, and again, it isn't hard to predict where the breakable walls are, and also the maps are optional anyway.
This is all compounded by the fact that a lot of enemies don't even drop rosaries at all. I mean, there are even entire areas where enemies don't drop rosaries, like Bilehaven. Oh, but you can sure lose all of yours there.
And let me stop any virgins in the chat before they give me the response to this. I do not care about the lore implications of why certain enemies drop rosaries and some don't.
You know, if there's one thing I hate about Metroidvanias, it's environmental storytelling.
All this reminds me of Bloodborne's blood file system, which was clearly a mistake. I think the devs kind of admitted it was a mistake when they put that one enemy in the DLC area that dropped like 5 of them for nothing. Like, why did you do this?
It's really not surprising that someone who dislikes environmental storytelling in Metroidvanias also dislikes resource scarcity in a survival horror game. My next note is literally just a timestamp, I do not know what it means. On one hand, I do understand the frustrations with fetch quests, but you really don't have to go too far out of your way to complete them. I completed the Spine Cores quest while just looking around that room and making sure to collect the cores as I kill the enemies. The Pilgrim Showers are collected from enemies that are pretty much everywhere in Act 1. The 2 Citadel quests can be cleared if you simply don't ignore the enemies as you're running from one location to another. The Crow Feathers quest, it literally just requires you to kill 5 enemies, so if you just get the quest before doing the fight room in that area, you get everything you need just by clearing it. The Silver Bells suck ass though, I can't defend that one. Next we have a complaint about the granularity of the crest system, and I've already said my piece on the crest system. Also they say that they both used exclusively Reaper Crest. Also, they say that equipping the new crest automatically serves no purpose. Like, what the fuck do you mean? It showcases the crest to the player. What do you mean it serves no purpose? Anytime, I swear, anytime these people pull Hollow Knight footage, it looks like they're trying to rage bait people. Sprint Master, Dash Master at the same time, Compass and Gathering Swarm at a time when you're so late into the game that you already have Grimchild and Grubsong. I don't think you need to be an expert in Hollow Knight combat to know how useless Grubsong is. By far, the phrase that these critics seem to hate the most is "get good." Now, with everything I've said so far, you might assume that I'm just another person saying "get good." And you'd be right. The reason people hate the phrase "get good" is because it's always completely useless as advice, and also because it carries connection to the subspecies that believe stuff like Mimic Tear ruins Elden Ring, but the way that many critics refer to it makes me believe that they simply hate learning. And I would just ask, why? Applying some critical thinking and realizing that maybe certain tools just aren't good, or that you're not using your crest the correct way, that can't be that hard, right? And surely it isn't unfun. After all, learning is what makes the interactive medium superior to all others. Also, fun is another quirky word that these people love to throw around. Like everything must serve fun in its simplest, most childish interpretation. But the fact is, Silksong was made with the belief that people would respect it. That when they would be faced with adversity, they wouldn't just go crying on the internet. Let me recap actually. If you make crests more customizable, they lose personality. If the double damage from boss fights and gauntlets is removed, the game loses all challenge. If rosaries were abundant, the game's motif of class oppression would be lost. The thing is, you do not wish to play Silksong, you wish to play its bastardization. You wish that every design aspect that is core to its experience rot and decompose simply to fit some arbitrary interpretation of fun. When this game was being developed, I am certain that Team Cherry was well aware that people like you were within their demographic. And I am glad that they did not give a shit.